Cool. Well, let's kick off biology with what we call levels of organization. Now, biology is the study of living things, but living things can be studied at completely different levels, and that often reflects the different disciplines within biology. So, for instance, when we look at ecology, that's probably looking at the bigger picture stuff, essentially how populations or groups of organisms interact. And as we come down from that, we then start to look at the organism, and that's where we're going to start here. So looking at the organism, an organism is basically a single living thing. So it's something where if we separate it into its parts, those parts wouldn't be able to live on their own. They work together to meet the criteria of life. That's, remember, Mrs. Gren, movement, respiration, sensitivity, growth, reproduction, excretion, nutrition. Um, so without all those different parts, well, an organism meets those criteria. Interestingly, there was an interesting article in New Scientist, which was essentially sort of making the case that maybe some of the bacteria that live in our body should essentially be considered part of us as an organism. Maybe together we should collectively be considered an organism, because we actually rely on some of those. And beyond just relying on some of those bacteria that dwell within us, we actually interact with them. They affect our gene expression, and we affect their gene expression. Um, so the relationship is very close, and many of you probably don't realize this, but actually there are 10 times as many bacterial cells in and on your body than there are human cells. Now they're much smaller, so they don't actually take up that much space. There's about 1.5, I think it's about 1.5 kilo of bacteria in the average person. So it's probably a bigger portion of us than you think. You're never alone. Anyway, the organism is made up of organ systems. So these are collections of organs. So things like the digestive system, or the skeletal system, or the nervous system. So whenever you hear those terms, you're actually talking about an organ system, which are actually made up of, okay, they're actually made up of several organs working together. So the digestive system, you've got the esophagus, the stomach, the pancreas, the liver, the small intestine, large intestine, all of those things working together towards a common function. If we go down a level, the organ each organ is made up of tissues, several tissues working together on the same job. And this is probably the term which students are often least familiar with, this idea of a tissue. So what is a tissue? Well, a tissue is basically made up of cells of a similar type. Now they don't have to be the same type, but a similar type working together to perform a particular function. It also includes any secretions or anything that those cells actually produce. So the cells and whatever they produce collectively form a tissue. And it really is based on that idea of function. So if there's cells working together towards a single purpose or function, they're considered part of the same tissue. Now, while we're on cells, we can group cells, and during the course of our studies, we're going to split cells into animal cells. So I've got a lovely picture of some red blood cells here. Plant cells, but we're also going to look at a group called prokaryotes, which are neither animal and plant cells. And we may look at some different cell types along the way. So cell types, you're probably more familiar with these than you think. So I've got some examples here. Adipose tissue is fat tissue, skin or epithelial cells, intestinal, bone, nerve, neural tissue, cardiac muscle, skeletal muscle, cartilage. So these are basically the thing that makes these things different is they're made out of different cell types. And like I said, you're probably more familiar with these than you think. So those are probably the 8 key different cell types that make up one of us. Now, the cells in turn are actually made up of what we call organelles. So organelles, that really means little organs. So again, it's like organs in the body have particular functions. The organelles here have particular functions too. And I'd like you to think of these as like little offices in a building. Each organelle is basically a compartment that has a different function, carries out a different has a different purpose. So just like a business or a skyscraper, they might have an accounts department, they might have the manufacturing floor, they'll have some room that's for utilities like power and water and things like that. So they'll have different rooms for different purposes. And most of these organelles are basically little sacs where the surface is made out of a membrane or a double layer membrane. And we'll look more at what the membrane really is, or what membrane is and what it's made out of. But essentially these are little sacs, usually with a single or double layer of membrane. And what actually makes them different is they have different things in their surface and inside them. So these really are essentially like rooms. Now some organelles, and that'll be quite apparent, the really small ones, and we're going to look at all of them in the next tutorial. But some of the organelles aren't actually little compartments or sacs, but the vast majority and all the big ones are. So, proteins. Proteins are really probably the most understated thing that we cover in biology. They often really don't get the credit they deserve. Proteins are really the moving working parts of a cell. And if we think of all those organelles like offices in a building, it's the proteins that really are the workers. So proteins can either be embedded in the surface, in the membrane, so in the walls, or can be found inside the organelle. And it's these proteins that carry out functions, usually biochemical functions, so either they synthesize other chemicals or they break them down. They can be involved in signaling. They can act as pumps to pump things across the membrane in and out of either a compartment or the cell. But these guys really are the working, moving parts of the cell. And it's really the proteins that are in the surface of an organelle or inside the organelle that make that organelle different from something else. Just like in an office building or in a company, it's really the people inside each room that determine what that room is used for, the function and its purpose, and without them nothing would really happen. So coming down a step from there, then we're really at the chemical level. So a protein technically is already considered a macromolecule, just a really big molecule. It's actually a very long chain of a chemical we call an amino acid. So when we get down to this level, we can also include things like DNA is also a large macromolecule. It's made out of small repeating units that are made out of a sugar, a phosphate, and a base called nucleotides. So these nucleotides are repeated thousands of times, or rather, millions of times. But each nucleotide simply consists of a sugar, a phosphate, and a nitrogenous base. So we're really starting to get down to the chemical level. Although we've got very large like macromolecules rather than simple molecules like water, we're really starting to cross into the boundary of chemistry now. Okay, so I've included this video because it gives you some insight into the life of a cell, what it looks like inside them. So here we've got some white blood cells rolling on the inside of a blood vessel. And looking at the surface, we can see a whole bunch of proteins there involved in that adhesion, but also the communication between that cell and the cells of the blood vessel. Here we're looking at the membrane, and you've got proteins embedded in the surface that are, again, those are the ones involved in that communication and that adhesion. Coming inside the cell, we're looking up now at the cell membrane, and we can see a vast array of proteins involved in signaling, or these here are structural proteins that give the cell membrane its sort of shape. These are structural proteins that span sort of the interior of the cell, and they really give the cell its overall shape. And also they're highly dynamic, constantly being arranged, built, and disassembled to accommodate shape changes and allow the cell to actually move. And it's actually proteins that actually are involved in this remodeling, this breaking apart and building together. These are slightly larger tubes called microtubules, which again are made out of proteins, and again they're very dynamic, being assembled and disassembled. But they're involved in transport, so you can see a special protein here that in that cyclic binding can actually transport that little bubble called the vesicle full of proteins and other chemicals. So having a look across the cell here, we can see that network of proteins that are used for structure but also for transport. Here we've got the nucleus, which contains all that information, those recipes for those proteins. And those recipes are coming out there in the form of RNA. And a ribosome, which we're looking at here, actually reads the recipe and makes a protein from that recipe. So that protein here is floating off. It looks like it's combined with another protein, and it's off to what looks like the mitochondria there in the background. Here's another ribosome reading that RNA recipe, making a protein into the endoplasmic reticulum. From there, they're transported in these bubbles to what's called the Golgi apparatus. There we see a bubble being transported up to the Golgi apparatus, where some of those proteins are further modified or packaged, or slight alterations are made. From there, they're actually transported further, and again in a vesicle, to the surface of the cell. They fuse with the surface, and some of those proteins are left embedded in the cell surface, or secreted into the surrounding cell space. So it's really these proteins, these are the moving working parts of the cell. Everything you've just seen happen in the cell is really happening because of all these proteins in the surfaces of the organelles, or the surface of the cell, or within the cell. And that allows this white blood cell to change shape and leave the blood vessel and reach a site of infection, and then to actually do all the things it needs to do to fight off that infection. So it's really the function of these proteins that gives cells their function. So I guess why I'm trying to show you this is I don't expect you to be able to understand everything that's going on there, or name all the different parts, but I just wanted you to appreciate that really what we are as a living organism is we're really the collection of trillions and trillions of proteins, working together. A whole bunch of these proteins working together give a cell their function. A whole bunch of cells working together give a tissue its function. Several tissues working together give our organs their function. And those organs working together give our organ systems their function. And together they give us as a living organism our functions, or essentially make us living. So really at its core, we're the complex, and we as living things are the complex interaction of trillions and trillions of proteins. Quite amazing, but it's quite amazing that these chemical things and that complex interaction really make us who we are. So that's it for the first tutorial. We're going to have a look at more at some of those compartments called the cell organelles in a minute. Cool.